Hi everybody, it's Professor Olney again. Welcome to the second half of the supply and demand video. This half of the video is going to be the shifts of supply and the shifts of demand. If you want just the basics as to what happens, why there's a downward sloping demand curve and an upward sloping supply curve, and just the basics of how we do supply and demand, that's a different video. Once again, you'll notice that I'm going to change clothes really fast. I'm not actually changing clothes. I recorded this whole video about 2 months ago and realized it was too long, and so I've split it into two. So the new intro right now is being recorded a couple months after I recorded the original video. So I hope this works out for everybody, and here we go. Erase that. If there is a change in demand, so the whole demand curve shifts, or a change in supply, or both, which is going to happen when one of those ceteris paribus assumptions is violated, then we're going to get a whole new equilibrium. So remember, we had those 5 demand shifters and we have the 4 supply shifters. The 5 demand shifters: income, wealth, other prices, buyer preferences, and expectations. The supply shifters: input costs, technology, prices of related products, numbers of sellers. Okay, here we go. Oops, there we go. All right, let's do a picture. Suppose something happens to lead to an increase in demand. So remember, an increase in demand means a increase in quantity demanded at each and every price. So draw your axes, and let me choose a color here. Violet. Let's do violet. Price on the vertical, quantity on the horizontal. If you want, why not? Let's just stick with frozen yogurt. So let's stick with the market for frozen yogurt. It's fun. So this is the number of 6-ounce cups of chocolate-flavored frozen yogurt that people want to buy in a week. There's some initial demand curve, D1. Again, it doesn't matter if it's a straight line or not. Don't worry about it. Just downward slope. An upward sloping supply curve, S1. There's an initial equilibrium. And at that initial equilibrium, the initial price is price P1, and the initial quantity is quantity Q1. Now suppose that there is an increase in income. That would give me an increase in demand. Suppose there's anything that gives me an increase in demand. So an increase in income would do it, an increase in wealth, a decrease in the price of ice cream, and so on. That increase in demand is shown as a shift to the right of the demand curve D2. And what will happen? Well, essentially, I don't know if I can do this. Essentially what's happened is this old demand curve D1, ooh, goody, look, good. This old demand curve D1, it no longer exists. The demand curve D1, that's what was true in the past, but it's not true anymore. That set of combinations of prices and quantities, old news, not true anymore. What's true now is that the demand, the set of prices and quantities, are captured by that demand curve D2. And that price P1, well, that price P1 is associated with the quantity supplied because it's still on the supply curve, but a much higher quantity demanded. So at price P1, this is now the new quantity demanded at price P1, and we no longer have equilibrium because quantity supplied and quantity demanded are not equal. That's going to put upward pressure on the price because there's this market shortage. Quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied. There's a market shortage equal to that horizontal distance between these two dots that are there. And so the price is going to start to rise. As the price starts to rise, we move along both the supply and the demand curve. As the price rises, the quantity supplied increases. We're moving along that supply curve. As the price rises, the quantity demanded decreases. We're moving along demand curve D2 until we reach the new equilibrium. The new equilibrium, let me dash it over. We'll call that price P2 and quantity Q2. So when there's an increase in demand, when the entire demand curve shifts to the right, we wind up with an increase in price and an increase in quantity in the equilibrium. Flip it over. If there's a decrease in demand, I'm not going to draw it because I've been here now for like almost an hour. If there's a decrease in demand, it would give us a decrease in price and a decrease in quantity. comparing the new and the old equilibriums. Okay, that's cool. Now, what about if we have an increase in supply? Now suppose instead, so this is instead, not also, but instead, again we're looking at the frozen yogurt market. So the amount of frozen yogurt that's sold per week. Price on the vertical, quantity on the horizontal, initial downward sloping demand curve, D1, sure. Initial upward sloping supply curve, S1. The initial equilibrium is where those things cross, so price P1, quantity Q1. Suppose that there's an increase in supply. It could be a decrease in input costs. Let's think about what happens if there's an increase in the number of sellers. So there's an increase in supply, there's an increase in the number of sellers, and when there's an increase in the number of sellers, what that means is that at each and every possible price, there's an increase in quantity supplied, so the entire supply curve shifts to the right. In effect, what's happened is this old supply curve, the the S1 supply curve, it ceases to exist. It doesn't exist anymore. That's just, it's about the past. It's not about the present. It doesn't exist anymore. What exists now for the supply relationship is that supply curve S2. Well, at that price P1, the new quantity supplied at a price of P1 is greater than the quantity that's demanded at that price of P1. And so P1 is no longer equilibrium price because now there is a market surplus at that price of P1. The existence of the market surplus is going to put downward pressure on the price. And as the price falls, the quantity demanded will rise, demand curve slope down. The quantity supplied will fall until we wind up at the new equilibrium where supply 2 and demand 1 intersect. And that's at a price of P2 and a quantity of Q2. So what do we get? We get that when there's an increase in supply, which remember means that the supply curve is shifting to the right, that increase in supply is going to lead to a decrease in price and an increase in quantity, comparing the new and the old equilibriums. If you flip it over, that is to say, if you decrease supply, which is to say shift the supply curve to the left, decreasing the quantity supplied at each price, the result is going to be an increase in price and a decrease in quantity, comparing the new and the old equilibriums. Cool. We're starting to be able to tell stories. There's one more story, and it gets a little more complicated, and that's what happens if both of these things shift at the same time. Now, in section, you're going to go through a variety of scenarios, and I'm going to just show you a couple of them here to try to illustrate what the challenge is when you have both things shifting at once. So here, let's draw, that's better. Let's draw our initial graph. So we've got price and quantity. Draw your initial demand curve D1. Draw your initial supply curve S1. Mark off your initial equilibrium, price P1, and quantity Q1. If it's confusing to you to have those dashed lines there when I went from P1 to Q1, you can get rid of them, except now I've really made a mess. So let me see if I can fix it. There. And there. But I think it's good to have. Here, let me just make little dashes. Okay. There you go. So there's our initial equilibrium. So let's do this. Let's suppose that we have both an increase in demand and an increase in supply at the same time. What we saw on the previous screen is that an increase in demand leads to an increase in price and an increase in quantity. And an increase in supply, a shift to the right of the supply curve, leads to a decrease in price and an increase in quantity. Since we're going to do both the increase in demand and the increase in supply at the same time, what we're going to see is that the quantity definitely is going to increase because both of those things, both the increase in demand and the increase in supply, are putting upward pressure on quantity. Excuse me. But the effect on price is ambiguous because the increase in demand is increasing the price, but the increase in supply is decreasing the price. And so what matters is the relative size of the shifts in demand and supply, and that's the only way you can figure out whether the price goes up or goes down. If you have a big increase in demand and a small increase in supply, the net effect is going to be the increase in price and again, an increase in quantity, because the increase in price, the effect on price from the demand is going to swamp the effect on price from the supply. If you have a small increase in demand, but a big increase in supply, then the supply part is going to have the dominant effect on price, and the net effect is going to be a decrease in price and again, an increase in quantity, comparing the new and the old equilibrium. So let me draw at least one of these for you. So let me draw a big increase in demand, D2, and a small increase in supply. Remember, increases mean the quantities are increasing at every price. So the new equilibrium is going to be at the intersection of demand 2 and supply 2. And you can see, dashing it over, the price has increased and the quantity has increased. So this is what I've done. Big increase in demand, a small increase in supply gave me an increase in both the price and the quantity. Let me show you the contrast. So here, again, I'm going to put price on the vertical, quantity on the horizontal, my initial downward sloping demand, initial upward sloping supply, initial equilibrium, price P1, quantity Q1, and I'm going to do an increase in demand, which by itself we know would increase price and increase quantity, and an increase in supply, which we know would decrease price and increase quantity. And the net effect on price, once again, depends upon the relative sizes of the shifts in supply and demand. So in this case, let me assume that I have a small increase in demand and a big increase in supply. So I'm going to shift my demand curve just a little bit. Demand D2. I'm going to shift my supply curve a lot. Supply S2. I'm going to find the new equilibrium, dash that over, label it price P2, dash it down, label it quantity Q2, and you can see what's happened is that there's been a decrease in price because price P2 is less than price P1, and again an increase in quantity because quantity Q2 is greater than quantity Q1 as a result of the shift. So when you have a double shift, when both demand and supply shift, there will be an ambiguous effect. So in this case, I had both of these things going up, and the effect on quantity was clear, but the effect on price, the net effect on price, was ambiguous. If they both go down, the same, I'm still going to get a clear effect on quantity, but an ambiguous effect on price. And then the last possibility here is, let me do one more graph for you. And then I think we're going to call it quits on this particular video because this has gone on way too long. All right, so then let me show you one more. And this is having the mix of increase in demand and a decrease in supply. So once again, let me draw the starting graph. So we're going to have a downward sloping demand curve, D1, upward sloping supply curve, S1, initial equilibrium price P1, quantity Q1. And this time let's explore what happens if there's an increase in demand and a decrease in supply. So what we know is we know the increase in demand will cause an increase in price and an increase in quantity. And we know a decrease in supply will cause an increase in price and a decrease in quantity. If both of those things happen at the same time, it's pretty clear what the price effect is going to be. Both the increase in demand and the decrease in supply are putting upward pressure on the price. But the quantity effect is ambiguous. We don't know without more information whether quantity is going to go up or down, because the increase in demand is making quantity go up, but the decrease in supply is making quantity go down. So if there is a big increase in demand and a small decrease in supply, then, well, we know the price effect. It's always going to be an increase in price. The demand effect is going to dominate on the quantity, and so the net effect is going to be an increase in quantity. If there's a small increase in demand and a big decrease in supply, again, clearly the price will go up, and now the supply effect on quantity will dominate, so we'll have a decrease in quantity. Let me show you both of those here. So on the left, now I'm going to draw in a big increase in demand. There's a big increase in demand, D2, and a small decrease in supply. So the supply curve is shifting to the left, S2, there we go. Find my new equilibrium, dash it over, price P2, dash it down, quantity Q2. And you can see that what's happened is the price has increased because price P2 is greater than price P1, and the quantity has increased because quantity Q2 is greater than quantity Q1. On the other hand, suppose that we have the small increase in demand and the big decrease in supply. Let me draw that down here at the bottom. So we have demand D1, supply S1, initial equilibrium, price P1, quantity Q1, and now, ta-da, I'm going to have a small increase in demand, demand D2, a big decrease in supply, supply S2. The new equilibrium is where S2 and D2 intersect. Dash it over, I've got price P2. The price rose. Of course the price would rise because both of these things are causing price to rise. And the quantity fell. So we've got an increase in price and a decrease in quantity because we've got a small increase in demand and a big drop in supply. Alrighty, that was a lot. This was actually a lot longer than I thought it was going to be. I thought I could knock this out in half an hour. Took me over an hour, but hopefully it's been really helpful to you. So check it out. Watch the video. I'm going to make a few more later on in the semester for other topics, and I hope this works out well for you. So have a great day. Go Bears. Let me go back to my